Welcome to Mi Estória, a podcast series where people of color in Humboldt County can share their stories, experiences, and perspectives. In this episode, Ena Cumming, a freshman business major, shares their experiences with imposter syndrome within their own community.
My name is Ena, and I'm a freshman at California. I was born in Ethiopia. I came here around about in between 2 and 3, and then when I was there, my now parents adopted me while I was there, and they are both Caucasian Americans.
So that's where you started. So where did you grow up at? In what area?
Yeah, I was raised in Riverside, California. It's a kind of city townish place in Southern California. It's in between LA and San Diego.
What was it like to grow up there, like diversity-wise, people-wise, you know?
There definitely was a lot of different people around. I grew up in most of my life where I had 16 years with my parents, basically from around 2 to when I left, which was a later part of when I was 17. And we lived in, most of the time it was in like what you would call the suburbs. And there was mostly white people. There was like a couple they were 2 like Asian, Hispanic, and then we had a Filipino family near us, and then a white and Mexican couple, and then everybody else seemed to be white.
How did that make you feel in that area? You know, did you feel fit in, or were you still like kind of a cast out or cast away?
I think I felt pretty fit in before I got into high school, because I was homeschooled for a while, and the way the people that my parents had around me, they wanted kids that would relate to me to be my friends. So most of them were adopted as well, which means most of them were internationally adopted. So they were from different countries around the world, and so we all kind of had different backgrounds, but kind of the same experience when it came to being an American.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the now. So when you came from Riverside, you said late 17 was when you left home, to here at HSU. How was that transition?
It was I think part of me was, it was kind of like a freeing point, partly because, you know, I'm about to be 18, I'm in college, I'm done with high school, I'm far away from everybody I know, so that was really nice. I think the hard part was definitely not having anyone that really related to me when it came to being an Ethiopian-American, and I think that was a big thing for me, because at home there was always someone I knew that was Ethiopian. Obviously most of my siblings, but everybody else were other people that might have been adopted, or somebody that lived in my city that went to my high school. And in my high school, there's always some people that were Africans, and we all went through our own struggle of being never really fitting in with not just everybody in general, because not everybody will look at someone and think, oh, you've never been here before, because I've been raised here most of my life, so I have most of the same mannerisms, I have the same sort of the same clothes, because, you know, my parents were kind of old school with different things, but so it was kind of a little bit of a struggle, but not as much as when I came here, because it was things like maybe the BSU, things like where they would a lot of Black people would congregate and be together, and it was a bonding experience for them. But I think one thing that hardly anyone understands is that there's always going to be a small minority in the minority of the Black race in America that aren't going to know everything when it comes to music, when it comes to the different dance styles they do here, and the food and all that. And we were raised to be very connected to our ethnicity and our culture is completely different, you know. And I I think it was less of then because I didn't really have to connect too much with other people that were of my race as much, because I connected with the Africans really easily, and I had my whole crew of them, and then I would have a lot of friends of different races and things like that. But coming here, it was kind of different because I felt like it was more of a necessity, kind of like you have to, because there is just another whole type of racism that I was kind of introduced to when I came here, and my parents tried to shield me from it as much as they could, and so I didn't get a lot of it, you know, and when there was any hint of it, my parents used their white privilege to erase it as much as they could. And here I no longer have that protection, and I'm also 18, so it doesn't really matter what my parents think or say anymore to other people. And so yeah, it's different. And I think since there's such a small minority of Black people here at Humboldt, it's kind of like they like to stick together really closely more than they would anywhere else. And it's kind of a whole thing where things they relate to is not just the melanin in their skin, but also things of the Black culture. And a lot of that has to do with what I said earlier, the food, the type of language, the things that they say, the things that they, the dances, the music, all that stuff. And the fact also that they are of the past of their people here. And that was something that I couldn't relate to or say I related to as much because I am Ethiopian. And it was the one country in Africa that wasn't colonized back when so much of Africa was colonized, and it was never enslaved by Europeans. You know, it wasn't, they fought really hard as much as they could to make sure that wouldn't ever happen. And the one time it did happen, it was a couple years in World War II, and then they got kicked out. So it was just a fighting thing that Ethiopians tend to be very proud of. And so I could never say, oh, I relate to the certain type of struggles your ancestors faced, because it was a different type of fight, where it was, instead of being torn from their country, it was them fighting hecka hard because they had that power of knowing the religion that the Europeans backed up with, and kind of knowing to use their own powers and using the bond that they had with each other to fight the colonization. And so I never really related too much to that, but I always researched and I tried to learn as much of the history as I could so I could be as empathetic to other people as I could. But I think here it was, the difference was not everybody who looks at me knows what an African really, like what an African, you know, quote unquote, looks like. And when they do figure out, they tend to forget that I was born there and that I was also not raised by people who knew all the, you know, the Black lingo, the music and all that, and did not teach it to me. So it was kind of like just thinking about, and just kind of like talking to you earlier was just talking about just like the struggles that I feel like a lot of people who were labeled as immigrants, who I don't think is a bad term, but if you come from another country, you tend to be very connected to it, whether you like it or not, and it's hard to erase that. And I will always be a first-generation American, and all my kids after me will be, you know, second generation, third generation, but I will always be the first one of my blood to be here. And it's always, I think it's going to be a struggle, and I think the biggest thing is try to use that as a way where I could connect people to what I feel like is the most important thing when it comes to being a Black person, and is knowing where your ancestors come from. Because, you know, we talk about how that you were stripped away from kind of like looking at where they came from and kind of creating your own world and culture here, and I feel like that's important to feel connected to each other and everything. Part of that is the reason why people who were first-generation Americans tend to be very not connected to maybe fifth generation or farther on of the same race, is because they're so disconnected from the culture that their ancestors came from. And so, like, personally for me, that can be everyday conversations, like, oh, like when they're talking about a movie they were raised that they love, or a certain type of song, and I might have no idea what it is, and it's, oh, we need to, like, we'll teach you, you know, and we'll teach you how to we'll give you a pass for that. And, it doesn't really faze me too much. It's not really that big of a deal, but it's just like, I feel like there needs to be more of a kind of like, I think when you say things like that, of what it really comes from. Just being more aware of how maybe someone who wasn't raised here, raised around people who might feel how they might feel about things when you say things like that. Because it might be a whole like, well, I'm already trying to fit in. I'm trying to be an American, and whether I like it or not, we're going to go through the same things when it comes to racism. Because when it comes to police brutality, they're not going to look at me. They're going to see the same color as the same as you. I'm not going to get a pass because because my ancestors weren't, slaves or anything. Like, that's not going to give me anything. So we're going to go through a lot of the same stuff. But it's kind of how, and I'm going to go through it whether I like it or not, but it's just also having that I already feel enough kind of sorrow of how far away I am from people with the same culture as me. So it's kind of like I want to bond with people of my race, but it's kind of like a whole like it really depends on how you act. Like if I see how it might be conversations that I overhear where I tend to things about comments about Africa, things like that, and I'm just like, there's one right in front of you, right? It's like, but just thinking back and forth, like, okay, but like I can be annoyed by it, but like, what's the way I can kind of help fix it? Because it does come from like not being really educated on it, and it's not their fault at all, because you can like people can scold them or whatever, Africans tend to do that, but it's kind of a whole like, well, you have to look in the history of how that really happened. It was a whole where that was the colonizers, they wanted to rip them from anything about their culture, and it did work. And that's the sad part. It worked over time, and it took effort. It took a lot of effort, but it worked for the most part. And that's what's really sad, is it takes a choice for every person to really try to get connected with the people people of their African culture, whether you're mixed of different things, and it's hard because they don't know where their ancestors came from. There's no, family tree that they can look all the way back and look at that. And so it's really heartbreaking, and that's why I try to keep it in my head that it's not their fault, no matter how affecting it might be to my day or my thoughts in the moment. It's kind of like, okay, well, it's not really their fault. It's not them trying to be mean or disrespectful in any way. It's kind of a whole just not being educated. And it's not like it's one of those, like, it's not really a right or wrong type thing where you're like, well, that wasn't wrong, because they really don't.
So like what you're trying to say is you want to decolonize by educating people of where they came from, which I think is a very valid point.
And I think it takes a lot of empathy, because it's not just going to be me, obviously. It takes some kind of reaching towards each other, and whether it's, you're never going to know. I mean, sometimes people be comfortable taking tests and figuring out what their genetics came from. But it's not just, I think, the simple step. I think the first step, because you don't really have to spend money to do that. It's kind of like, it's just like understanding that you will always be, whether you like it or not, you will always be African. There's no other like continent that your ancestors came that you're literally going to identify with. And I think if you just step into that kind of like the identity that you are, that your ancestors, that's something that they never wanted to be taken from you. And I feel like it takes like kind of looking to yourself on what you're kind of afraid of, and it's, it's an everyday struggle. And even first generation of any culture, any other continent goes through the same thing. They want to fit in. They want to, they want to be accepted. And it's kind of like, but you have to remember where you come from and be proud of it. Be proud of the foods. Be proud of the dances. And that's why when I work on campus, I try to imply those things, like just talk about it as much as I can with people. Like, I'm proud, that I am African and that I'm Ethiopian. And it's kind of a whole thing where it's just like, okay, hosting dance workshops like the one I just did with, that was the Afrobeats one. And, it's just like a stepping into it. It doesn't mean that you forget everything that you've been raised by, but it's just stepping into that awareness too, that there's also a whole nother world that you have never stepped into. And that also belongs to you as well. Yes. Because it's your guys as well. It's always going to be yours, whether you accept it or not. And even if you go, like, I know there's going to be experiences where people in America, people in America go into Africa and they feel like so kind of lost, and then they are set apart, obviously, from every other person who's lived there, and so they kind of know, oh, they're American, or they're not being raised here.
They're not one of us.
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome goes both ways, basically, you know?
It goes both ways, and I think as a person, I think being adopted helped a lot, because it's not just, it was me stepping into it both ways, and I know that I will always be accepted where I came from, because I know kind of I've been raised with Ethiopian food. I've known and loved all those things, but and I have the features and all that where it's kind of like it's kind of being, I will always be accepted there, but I can understand where they're coming from when it comes to the imposter syndrome when they go to Africa, but it's the same way I feel when I come in here. And I think it's that understanding that it goes both ways, but you need to be aware of, you don't, like, the way you feel when you go there is the way they feel when they come here. And it's just like, I think that's like the first step to kind of join hands and kind of just kind of fix it, because it kind of, there's misunderstanding on both ways. I think they feel so disconnected and we feel disconnected because, you know, at the end of the day, if people who are more educated, it's kind of like a heartbreaking thing where you're just like, oh, they were ripped. They're our ancestors. People that might have stayed here, their families were ripped away and brought to this other land. So it's kind of like a whole understanding that we should be, like, the way that people here are brokenhearted and affected by the colonization is a different type of brokenheartedness there. And even though people don't really talk about it as much, it's still there. You know, it's still like we lost a lot of people everywhere that that were forced to go into America, and it was kind of like population was decreased a lot in certain areas, especially, and so it's always going to have effect. Colonization had a different effect, where it's kind of like here it was so many people were brought here and treated terribly, but there it was kind of like a whole, they just came into ours, you know, like trying to take over and left it barren and ridden and kind of affected in totally different ways, where Africa will never be the same. And
similar to the Native Indigenous population.
And I think that is why I relate so much to Native Americans and the indigenous population, because they kind of are, they were affected in the same way as Africans were, and it's kind of like a whole where I feel like that's the bond that I have with other minorities, you know, whether it's indigenous, Latinx, whether it's even Asian, any other type, where it's just like, oh, we all feel that type of connection to our culture, and it's the one culture and race that is not that way, and that is the Black. And it's kind of it's really heartbreaking that was so successful, and it's kind of not really think about, because it's absolutely crazy that was able to happen, and it's so effective and evident so far ahead of when that happened, so far ahead, hundreds of years, and you're still in a standstill where it's like, now we are totally disconnected, and it's totally like a whole, like, where we notice when you come into our place, and we notice, or you notice when we go to each other, so it's kind of like a difference where it's kind of like, okay, yes, there was going to be a difference for a bit. And I think that's why I respect so many other people when they kind of step into that whole, I'm African, you know, because even if they don't know where their ancestors came from, but they kind of step into it, trying to learn more, educate themselves more. And it's really happy for me to see. It's just that attempt and the motivation and just like the open-heartedness to learn something new about where your ancestors came from, you know. And there are people on campus who I love to spend time with, and it's kind of opening your eyes where it's like a whole new journey for them. It's kind of like, for me, the way they feel about going into learning more about their ethnicities or their race or the connection and trying to build that, the decolonization is the way I felt when I kind of tried to rebond with my own family in Ethiopia when I was adopted, when I figured out all the people that I thought I was also disconnected with are still alive. And so that's why I kind of relate to it in a way where it's kind of like, I kind of have, it kind of strikes a nerve for me more just for that. I think that experience, and then coming here right like a year after and seeing this more in an evident way again kind of makes me want to talk about it more.
You're like, oh, well, it's not like a right or wrong thing. It's just we need to educate.
And it's just an openness. I think when we get comfortable enough to be vulnerable about those experiences, I think that would be a very bonding thing and opening eye for everyone. And just like you said, in Humboldt, you have to stick together whether you like it or not. You're not always going to be safe. You're not going to be always going to have somebody in every area that you could go through and trust. That there's not going to be someone that completely relates to you for your culture in every club, in every party and everything. There's not always going to be, for me, I can go to parties where I might be the only black person or the only black girl, and sometimes that doesn't feel the safest, and it's that thing. So you kind of have to deal with it, but also it's just time to, I think it's time that people stop really complaining about it and isolating from each other and actually try to band together and try to find a solution or some way, because that is, as long as we complain and isolate, that is exactly the reason why this has all happened, was for this to be this way. And if we fight against it, it's kind of like a middle finger to their face, like no, this is what you wanted, but this is not what's going to happen. No matter how long it worked, it's not going to work anymore.